This is Restoring Liberty. I'm here with Doug Frank, Dr. Doug Frank. He's a Nobel Prize nominee. He's been very active on the vote fraud issues. Dr. Frank, thank you so much for joining me and our listeners at Restoring Liberty.
Happy to be with you.
So, Dr. Frank, I read a little bit about you. Of course, I've been involved with Mike Lindell and his efforts against vote fraud, spoken several times at his conventions. You are the go-to guy when it comes to vote fraud. But before I get there, I'd like our listeners to know a little bit about your background. First, Nobel Prize nominee. That's a pretty big deal. What was that in, and how did that come about?
That happened in 1990. I made a major scientific discovery in my field, which is the field of surface electroanalytical chemistry. Basically, that's a lot of words, which just means I know what happens at the surface of metals. That's basically what that means. But I developed a technique for making three-dimensional images of molecules, first time ever. People were able to do that, and it made a splash on the international scene. I was on the cover of Nature, cover of Science magazine. It was a big deal. My favorite thing about that, I have about 60 scientific publications related to that, but my favorite part about that is it gave me notoriety and reputation, and so I got to leave academics. I got to leave formal academics, university academics, which was becoming increasingly toxic to honest, clear thinking. So I left that in 1996 and formed a couple of businesses and did that for about 25 years, and moved out to the country in 2017, closed down my major manufacturing plants and whatnot, and planned to spend the balance of my career building electronics, custom electronics for people. But instead, I ended up trying to save the country from our election debacles.
And I want to get to that in a minute, but one of the things I also heard about you is that you're one of the first people on the internet. Tell me about how that came about.
That's the truth. You know, I'm 62 years old, and I grew up near San Francisco in the Bay Area, and that was kind of one of the, a little south of there is the hub of the internet. But I was programming computers back in the 70s, and then because of my ability in that area in electronics and computing, and I was an undergraduate student in Santa Barbara, California in the early 80s, I was brought onto a DARPA grant called the DARPANet. It was when they were developing the internet for the first time. There were 300 of us on that. And I remember joking with people, what a waste of time this is. It took me two days to send an email from Santa Barbara to Poland. And so I was telling everybody, this thing is what a waste of time. People shouldn't be wasting their time on this. Boy, was I wrong.
Yeah, so 1992, I guess, was the year I went into law school. Yale Law School, they had a computer room full of monitors, the great big old CRTs. Yeah. And they were one of the first universities that had connection to the internet. And I recall going in there, all these guys are sitting there trying to download pictures. I think that was the primary objective that they had. And they'd spend about an hour trying to get one image. And I thought to myself, this is not going anywhere. Of course, now we got AI and have all sorts of electronics, and part of which, of course, impacts this whole vote fraud issue. And I'm curious. So you went through this, discovery that led you to the Nobel Prize nominee, dozens of scientific journal publications, obviously success in business. And then you decided to stick your nose in vote integrity, which I'm sure has not been terribly profitable for you. Tell me how that came about.
All the work I do in this area is gratis. I don't charge for any of my events. I don't charge for any of my work. And I made that decision early on in 2021, or early 2021, because there were too many people I could tell were grifting this movement. They're making a living off of it. And I didn't want anybody to have a reason to question my motives. So you're right. I'm not making any money at this. I'm losing money, like Mike Lindell is losing money.
Right. And so, anybody that's fighting against this establishment, if they're making money doing it, there's something wrong. You may know a little bit about my background, ran in 2010 against Murkowski, beat her in the primary. And that was my first exposure to vote integrity issues. Alaska's permeated with those issues. We'll get to that here in just a minute. But folk that are fighting this system, either one, they're independently successful before they start, and many of them end up on the losing end by the time they're done. But the reality is, if they're actually out there making money doing what they're doing, you better take a second look. That may not always be the case, But I can tell you, most of those folk that I've rubbed shoulders with that are trying to fix this system, it's not been intensely profitable. But we really appreciate the efforts that you've made. So, again, if you could tell our audience why vote integrity, what actually triggered this for you?
So I voted in 2020, and my youngest child, Derek, who's 18, he and I went and voted together, and we took selfies, and it was a proud day, and I thought it was going to be a real election. I had already run the numbers on the election. I'd been modeling elections for 40 years, and I was assuming, I mean, it was a 20-1 odds that Trump was going to win, and so, that evening, I was watching the election results coming in, and like many people, I was like, something doesn't smell right. It doesn't pass the smell test. Something's amiss. But I didn't really investigate any further. But then you might recall that later in November, Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania held a special public hearing where a lot of the evidence of fraud was being discussed and presented. The very next day, I got a phone call from a candidate there in Pennsylvania. Her name is Kathy Barnett. She's from Montgomery County. You'll recall that Montgomery County is the county where 4 Supreme Court cases were filed. And she called me and said, would you please look at my election? She and I had become friends during the COVID epidemic. And I said, sure, I'll look at it. So she sent me the data. I looked at the data. Holy mackerel, I found all kinds of anomalies that needed investigation. So she introduced me to the investigative committee of the legislature of Pennsylvania. They put me on a team. There was a team of 6 people. And we began investigating. And it only took about a week and a half. We had found massive amounts of fraud. When I say massive amounts of fraud, I'm not being hypothetical. I'm not using statistical evidence. I'm saying we have documented case of fraud. And what I mean by documented, we have all the logs proving who logged in and who cheated and who stuffed and everything. We have the whole 9 yards. So that's what got me engaged. And at the time, I was, a naive, I'm not experienced politically. I'm a scientist. I assumed that if you give people evidence that they would take proper action. Boy, was I confused. I was a rube politically. And I was assuming, Pennsylvania is a majority Republican. They must be good. Okay. So forgive me for being naive. Okay. But I learned they had no intention of cleaning up the problem. And so then after that, it's a long story, but we don't get into it here. But we can do it another time if you'd like. But then I did Florida next, and I found almost as much fraud there as they had in California. Now I was like, wait a minute. These are 2 Republican majority states, and it's even in there. Went and did North Carolina next. I was trying to find a clean election,
right?
Because I'm a scientist, and I look for controls, and I couldn't find a clean election. I did Ohio next. After that, I chose the states I just described because they're a Republican win, and the data are available online, so I could download their voter rolls and find out every person who voted, where they lived and everything. And all the algorithms that I had developed in Pennsylvania, I was applying in the other states and finding exactly the same problems that I had found there and demonstrated there. So then I did that for the first several months of 2021. And then Mr. Lindell discovered me. And if you'll recall, he made a movie called Absolute Proof. He did that in January of 2021. And his second movie was called Scientific Proof. And that's his interview with me. It's a 1-hour movie where he was so excited by the results I had that he made a documentary about me called Scientific Proof. And then he made a third movie called Absolute Interference. And the first half an hour of that is an interview with me discussing some more of my results. Now, as soon as that happened, then suddenly I went from obscurity and this YouTube having tens of millions of people knowing who I was. And so people all over the country started inviting me to help them. Legislatures asked me to testify. I began meeting with secretaries of states, attorneys generals around the country. I spent all of 2021 thinking I could fix the country from the top down. So once again, that illustrates my naivete when it comes to politics. But I learned in 2021 that we weren't going to fix this top down. So I spent all of 2022 basically learning from the grassroots how to build a movement, how to affect change starting at the local level. So my motto is, and I learned this from the grassroots as well, that education is key, but the fix is local. And so I've been going around the country teaching local communities how to prove that fraud has happened in their own community and then what to do about it, and a strategy that allows them to take back their election. So that's basically been my life now for 3 years.
Have you been asked to testify as an expert witness in any of the election fraud cases?
Oh, yes.
And have you actually participated in any such cases?
Yeah.
One of the, and again, I'm not to play devil's
The
advocate.
Michigan case is a famous example, right? Michigan, my depositions in that, and in Northern Oregon, Washington County, Oregon, I was in that case. My data have been used in multiple other lawsuits. I didn't testify in person in those, but I gave a deposition and my evidence was included in the case. Go ahead.
So what do you attribute? Of course, one of the things that the naysayers use is that, look, there were dozens of cases that entertained questions of fraud in the 2020 election. And in every solitary case, the courts turned back the challenges. What do you attribute that to, especially given the overwhelming fraud that you found in your investigations?
I attribute that to people not, okay, how do I say this charitably? I want to say I attribute that to stupid strategy, but that would not be nice. In other words, I'm a scientist, and I demand rigorous evidence before I make claims. And so early on, people were, all emotional and all upset, and people were making outlandish statistical claims that were unverified. And if you go to court with, statistical claims that don't have solid backing to them, a judge should reject those things. And so I that's what I attribute it to. There are about a dozen states or so where massive reports were prepared, quote unquote, containing voter fraud. But I've read those and they don't. And so people are confused. People, don't have legal backgrounds. People make unsubstantiated claims. And that's one of the reasons why I persist in this movement. And people value what I do because I actually give them a way to document actual, real fraud. And that's different.
And don't you think that there's a lot of misinformation out there? I mean, it's not just sloppiness, but the enemy. I mean, you've got to be very cognizant of the fact that the powers that have been established in our country, and it is a duopoly. You and I talked about this briefly before we went on the podcast today.
Yes.
We've got Republican and Democrat. I'm no longer a Republican. I mean, a lot of people think, oh, you beat Lisa Murkowski in 2010, you must be a Republican. Republican Party, although I still vote every election, obviously, the fact is that the folk that control that party, for the most part, are establishment individuals that want the same thing the Democrat establishment wants, and that's the growth of government, the reduction of freedom, and they certainly want to keep a cap on elections. They want to continue to be able to control them. And my perspective is, given the time that I spent in politics, very frequently when you're challenging that power, you will always have offers to help come in from various quarters, many of whom you've never had contact with before. And sometimes that information is not there to help, it's to detract. And one of the things I saw, in the post-2020 elections is a lot of detracting information, some of which may or may not have been intentional, just to, I think, undercut the validity of those claims.
I think you and I see eye to eye on that. And you even mentioned that, your own campaign was infiltrated. And yes, we have had infiltrators in this movement and people spreading disinformation, and it damages the credibility of the real claims. And so I'm with you on that. I think we see eye to eye. I've learned that we don't have a single legislature in this country that is pro-election integrity. Every single one of them is making elections more easier to cheat, and not more and more secure. So it's shocking, actually. Now, because of this movement is gaining momentum, there's are starting to be some exceptions. For example, the precinct strategy, where grassroots people become precinct committeemen and committeewomen and take over the GOP. That is beginning to gain momentum around the country. About 6 states now, the grassroots has taken over the GOP. For example, in Nebraska, and so they've elected. They've thrown out the old deadwood and put in grassroots kinds of folks, people that have the same values that we conservatives do. And consequently, those legislatures are now having to sit up straight and pay attention, because otherwise they lose the support of their own party. So, that's happened now in Kansas, in Nebraska, Georgia, several other states. And those states...
So you've got Georgia... Go ahead. Well,
they haven't implemented any legislation yet. And I think it would be naive, I've learned my lesson, to assume that they're going to suddenly fix their elections legislatively. I'm not assuming that. But they have to sit up and take notice. And so there is some progress in a few states. Go ahead.
So you have Georgia, obviously a swing state. Any of the other, what we might call or see as in 24, the swing states, are there any other positive changes that might help entrust the election here in 2 years, the next year?
Yes and no. I liken the situation to a David and Goliath situation. You know, we who want election reform are the David, and Goliath is the corruption and the election establishment that is in place. I don't think that we are going to win with our own efforts. I think it's going to take a miracle, just like it took a miracle with David and Goliath. But I believe we're fighting on the right side. And as David said to Goliath, you know, this battle is the Lord's battle. This is not my battle. And I believe that as well. So our job is not necessarily to win. Our job is to stand and fight and to, you know, to do what, to fight on the side of right. So do I think necessarily that because of this effort, we're going to fix 2024? No, but unless there's a miracle. But what I am seeing around the country is a movement that's gaining momentum, and it's rapidly gaining momentum, where I'm not necessarily winning whole states. I'm winning counties and cities. You know, I mentioned earlier that Shasta County, Northern California, I call them beachhead counties, where we get one county in a state to flip. What do I mean by that? Flip means they go back completely to paper poll books, paper ballots, hand-marked paper ballots. They count them, they tally them. Everything's done by hand. Why do I like that? Not because I have anything against electronics, obviously. I build them for a living. But because anything electronic is hackable, trackable, manipulatable, everything on paper can be locally controlled. So it puts the control back in the hands of local communities, away from the central control of the state governments, which is why they oppose it so much, by the way. But I've got beachhead counties now in multiple states. And so, yes, that's the positive feeling. Now, if you were going to say, do I have beachhead counties in the swing states? I guess you might mean like Georgia and Arizona and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Yes, I do. We're having tremendous success in Wisconsin, for example. I've got multiple communities there that are all back to paper, and more to come, and many on the verge. Surprisingly, I've got counties in California. And people are saying, how can that possibly happen, Dr. Frank? You know, that place is communist, kind of like Alaska. And what I tell them is the reason why I'm having success in California is because they're under Marxism, and so the grassroots has been activated. You know, when I go to a lot of states, like when I go to Georgia, people don't even realize how far gone they are. So I have to wake them up first just to get them aimed in the right direction.
Well, not only that, in California, you've got some really solid northern counties that
yes,
actually tend to be as conservative as some of the red states. And so you do have opportunity, especially when you're
yes,
identifying in these states that have been taken over. You got a county that you turn. You've got good vote integrity in that county. Then it's going to be an outlier if the entire state is subject to this electronic fraud. And then you can prove it. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
you're exactly right. It's an outlier, and also it sets dominoes in motion where other counties begin to copy it then, which is why California is like radioactive right now. The legislature is passing new laws left and right trying to stop 4 other counties from following suit after Shasta County went.
Yeah, and it's also, I mentioned this to you earlier about Argentina. You know, the Argentine president, he's obviously an anti-establishment guy. There's some interesting aspects of him, but one of the concerns he had running up to his election was that, hey, you know, the electronic voting, it's going to take the election from me. It's all fraudulent. They ended up doing a hand-cast, hand-counted election, and it was done in a matter of hours. And the only reason why I bring that up, because I know that there are all sorts of other things, including ballot security, that have to be addressed, is that one of the primary arguments that's been used against us in Alaska, against other folk in other states working for this, is that, look, if you retain control at the local level, where the local level is counting ballots, maintaining security of ballots, it's just not practical, right? You just can't count all these ballots. You just can't handle all this by hand at the local level. Too complicated, too much stuff. But again, like what was seen in Argentina recently and what has been done in other counties throughout the United States reflects that that's just a straw man. In reality, it's very doable, and it's what the country did for years, well, decades, you know, before.
Hundreds of years.
Yes, exactly.
And by the way, we were still doing it 20 years ago when we were only 10% smaller.
Right.
It's absolutely feasible, and all of Europe does it in a single day, for example, and they've outlawed the machines there and outlawed electronic systems precisely because they're so hackable.
Right.
So it's absolutely feasible. We have teams of people going around the country right now teaching people how to go back to all paper. It's 10 times cheaper. It returns control to the locals, and it increases voter participation. It's a win on all fronts, except the establishment.
Exactly.
It's a loss to them. They don't like not having control.
Well,
even the legislators like knowing where they stand in an election during all that early voting. The legislators like knowing, oh, gee, we don't have to send postcards to that residence because they already voted. We can save money. And all these arguments they make to argue why we need to have this system that's completely vulnerable is because they feel like it helps them. But that's the whole point. They should have to sweat it out like the rest of us. It should be on one day. We should vote in person, on paper, with photo ID, like they do in 149 other countries, and then have, do the paperwork and be done. And we can do it in a day or two, and the whole matter's ended, and it's secure and transparent and auditable and back under local control, which is how you secure election. Does that solve all fraud problems? Well, of course not.
No, in fact, that's a great segue into Alaska. We, as my listeners are aware, many of whom were supporters of mine during my Senate campaigns in Alaska, in 2010, beat Lisa Murkowski, senior senator from Alaska, in the primary. There was an effort by the establishment in that primary to still it. They sent functionaries into a division of election office with a jump drive, got caught, never got prosecuted, but it was too late. Too little, too late. We ended up winning by surprise in the primary. But in the general election, it was all hands on deck as far as the fraud goes. And the only reason why we were able to see that is because we ended up with election challenges after the election, where we actually were able to put hands on ballot. And there are a number of articles, if any listeners aren't familiar with the race, at joemiller.us, Restoring Liberty, that's the website. At the bottom are a series of articles about the fraud that took place in 2010. But that was the first exposure, the real public exposure that Alaska had about the just utter lack of ballot security. Alaska's a state down controlled state. There's very little in the way of county controls, very little in the way of even precinct control. The ballot security in 2010 was handled by a group called Gold Belt Security, which was a subsidiary of a native corporation that had been active in contributing literally, we believe, millions of dollars of direct and in-kind support to Murkowski's campaign. And they maintained ballot security from the time that the ballots left precincts all the way up to and including the time of the ballot review in Juneau. And what we discovered in the ballots is that literally hundreds, if not thousands, of ballots had been filled out prior to the election. It was write-in, for those of you who don't recall, in 2010. The signatures were the same across precincts. In other words, the excuse that the lieutenant governor of Alaska gave that, this was just federally authorized voter assistance, somebody helped them fill out their ballot, doesn't work. Can't have the same person hundreds of miles away in a different precinct. So we realized at that point there was a huge problem with ballot security. And it wasn't just access before the election, it was also how the ballots were provided to precincts in Alaska. You received in precincts in Alaska the number of voters by registered votes. And so normally, if you have a 40 to 50% turnout, you have almost double the ballots at that precinct than are cast. So what happens to the excess ballots at the end of the day? Well, in Alaska, they just trust the precinct folk to destroy them. There's not ballot accountability. So what stops somebody, bad actors at the precinct level, when the voting is done, or even before filling out other ballots and feeding those through the Diebold machine? At the time, Diebold, of course, now we've moved upward and better, supposedly, to the Dominion machine. But in any event, have you discovered that type of ballot security problem throughout the United States? And have you looked at Alaska's problem specifically?
Yes and yes. I tell people it doesn't matter how many times you count the cash in the register. What matters is how many of the bills are counterfeit. And you said something really critical in your comment there. You said they look at the number of people registered in a precinct and they send them the ballots. Well, guess what? You in Alaska have more people in your voter rolls than you have voting age people. You have the dirtiest voter rolls in the country. So if you send a bunch of ballots to precincts for names that don't exist, you're basically equipping local nefarious actors with a credit line of ballots that they can stuff. There's actually a name in the rolls that would line up with that ballot. But guess what? That name in the rolls is not a real voter. How do we know? You can't have more real voters than you have people. And you're at 108%. You have the dirtiest voter rolls in the country. Judicial Watch has been going around the country suing states and counties for having this situation. It's not just me that's discovered this. There's about 350 counties in the country that have more people in their voter rolls than they have 18 and older people, voting age people. And there are 8 states, including yours, that have more people in the voter rolls as a state even. And it's not just, people say, well, sure, yeah, it's in Juneau, yeah, they're liberal. Sure, that's where the fraud is. Wrong. It's across the whole state of Alaska. And in my presentations, which is why I'm talking to you today, I think we're promoting that a little bit. It's my first trip to Alaska. In my presentations, I show people their own voter rolls, and I show how their own voter rolls are inflated beyond their own population. So it's not just in the capital, it's across the whole state. And guess what? That's the pattern I see across the whole country. And that's the benefit of, that's a perspective I have, which is very valuable because I've done now over 3,000 counties worth of analysis right down to the address level. I know the situation across the country. I can show you state after state after state. I've already analyzed these right down to the gnat's eyelash. I can show you how much fraud you have, and it's about 10% in your state. So, you as somebody who ran for election, if I gave you a 10% fraud, you could change every election.
Without a doubt. What I wanted to do is touch back on the voter roll, 108% inflated in Alaska. So how does that translate into fraud? How's that used?
Well, if you have people, like, for example, let me make it super simple because, it's hard to explain without pictures. I've got graphs for all this, but let me make it simple. Let's say that you have, you're in Alaska now, you're going to mail ballots to everybody. You've gone to all mail just this last year. So let's say you mail 100 ballots out. And let's say that 30 of the people that you're mailing to are not real voters. They don't live here anymore. They're dead. They were illegal aliens put into the rolls. They're residents who've left for whatever reason. 30% of them are not real. So you send out 100 ballots. Now that's 30 of them go into the wind. 70 of them go to real voters. And let's say that 60 of those 70 return their ballot. So let's say it's a close election and it's 30 to 30 out of that 60. I'm keeping the math easy. So, 60 ballots are returned and the race is 30 to 30. Well, keep in mind, there are 30 ballots out there floating in the wind and they have a cash value and people have a motivation to win the election. So all you have to do is scrape up a few of those and stuff them using the names of the people who aren't real so that they don't even know, did that happen? So you can easily win 32, 33, 34 to 30. And no one knows the better.
But somebody's going to have to know where those ballots are going, right? So this
exactly.
This requires a level of knowledge.
And that's where I come in because I have access to the voter rolls. Well, wait a minute. If I have access to the voter rolls, who else has access to the voter rolls? And also, get this. This is a fact I can demonstrate to you. I have access to the voting machines. What do you mean you have access to the voting machines, Dr. Frank? Anybody with a high school level hacking ability can hack into the machines during the elections and know what the tallies are. So if I know during the election what the tallies are, vote tally, and I know during the election who's voted and who's not voted, I know who to stuff ballots for. And I've got this huge credit line. I've got 30 people, 30 names I can stuff for. So I just have to watch the tally, see how it's going and say, oh, gee, I need a few more. I guess I'll put a few more electronic votes on this thumb drive and hand it to somebody who's going to go stick it in the computer. And then while they're doing that, I'm going to mail in the paper ballots to back that up. That way, after the election, if there's a recount, it doesn't matter because after the election, the ballots will match the electronic count. And that's why counting the ballots or merely doing recounts doesn't expose the fraud. You have to go back to the voter rolls and you have to find the people who quote unquote a ballot was cast for them, but it wasn't really them. And that's how we prove the fraud. We find dead voters. We find people who don't live in the state anymore and are voting in another state. How come I can do that? Because I have 48 states worth of data. That's how come I can do that. I can tell you who voted in every state. So we find the fraud that way. And so you see what I'm saying? It's a way for us to prove it. Go ahead.
So one of the things we've attempted to do is obviously alert folk throughout the state to the inflated rolls. We've known that those rolls have been inflated for some time. We've had contact directly with the head of our division of elections, which is the lieutenant governor, about this issue. And of course, the excuse that we get back, not the current lieutenant governor, but past lieutenant governors, has been, well, federal law requires us to keep certain names on the rolls, and if we end up cleaning it up, we're going to follow scants of federal law. Of course, never mind the fact that we're in the top 10 across the United States for inflated rolls. What is your answer to that? That, we got to err on the side of caution with respect to the names that are on the roll, that we can't really be aggressive in the cleanup of voter registration rolls.
There is no federal law that says you have to keep a dead person in your voter roll. Okay? There is no federal law that says you have to keep somebody in your rolls who's moved to another state. The federal law was put in place, HAVA we're talking about, 2002, and NVRA 1993. The federal law says if someone doesn't participate in an election 2 in a row, 2 federal elections, you are required to investigate. And so what most states do is they send a postcard to them, and if it doesn't come back, then they're required to put them on inactive status or remove them from the rolls. But there is no federal law that says you have to keep anyone in the rolls who isn't here anymore. So it's not, they're not quoting you the law properly. They're saying, oh yeah, federal law says that we have to remove them after two cycles. But no, that's not the truth. The truth is you can remove them tomorrow if they left today. But it takes work to do that. And what's happened is over the last 2 decades, all the counties in boroughs, as they're called in your state, have basically defaulted to the state to do the voter roll maintenance. And like a local clerk who sees that someone dies locally, she could remove that person immediately, but not in all states. In some states, they say, no, we're not going to let you remove them. It has to be removed at the state level. And so there are all these barriers between local clerks and the state voter rolls to allow them to clean it up. And the states are complacent and they like having inflated voter rolls. So that would be how I would address this. But it's sort of a backwards reading of the federal law. Now, what's really going on also is, let's say, Joe, that you moved to Colorado. So now you don't live in Alaska anymore. Did you call your clerk and tell them to remove you from your voter rolls? I doubt it. Almost nobody does that. That's supposed to be done by us, civic responsibility. But let's say that you're a responsible citizen and you know this, and so you call up your clerk and say, hey, I'm moving to Colorado, go ahead and take me out of the rolls. She'll say, I'm not allowed. I'm going to send you a form that you have to fill out, and it has to have all this documentation in it. And then when you return it to me, I'll give it to the state, and then they'll remove it. You see where this is going? They've made it very difficult technologically and technically to clean the voter rolls. So that's another reason why they've grown ridiculously.
Well, Dr. Frank, let me give you an example of how ridiculous it is in the state. The state registration rolls are controlled by the state. There's not the level of local control like we find in other states. And right. What happens is when they send out, for example, a notice to an address, and it has a voter's name on it that doesn't belong at that address, on the front of the envelope it says, please return to sender if the individual is not at this address. I have an office in Fairbanks that every year we have received ballots in the names of other individuals. It happens that my office used to be the location of the Democratic Party. I own that office. I've been there for 20 years. Every year we've returned those ballots, returned to senator, to the Division of Elections in Juneau. And guess what? We still get those names in every election cycle. And so it's outrageous.
What I'm telling you, that the rolls are dirty and they don't clean them up.
It's by intent. It has to be. It's the only way that you can conclude it. One of the other problems that we have in Alaska that we discovered in 2010 were the issue of felons voting. Major issue. And of course, we went to our our Department of Corrections after 10 because we knew that there were dozens of felons that had voted, and literally just an absolute bar to information. Would not provide it, couldn't get it. We did Freedom of Information Act request. We didn't go the litigation route. We probably should have, but that's another area, although it's not the same type of fraud that we're talking about, but it is another area that's being utilized, I think, in part to affect elections. But we're drawing short on time. What are your action points for Alaskans to clean up our election system here?
Well, I have a strategy. It's called 7 Steps for Taking Back Our Elections. I've derived it after doing this hundreds of times and learning what works and what doesn't work. It's not like I sat in front of a fireplace one day with my pipe and figured this all out. This is me. In medicine, they call it best practices. You do what works, and you keep trying different things until you find what works. Well, I've converged on a strategy. It's called 7 Steps. The first step is to get connected. And why is that important? Well, because you need to learn how to think about the problem, and you need to learn where the problems are and how to address them. And if you have to relearn the lessons that I've just spent 3 years learning, it's going to be 3 years from now till you're where I'm at. So don't do that. Get connected, learn from us who have been working this so we can teach you. That's much faster, and it connects you to national resources as well. Second step is to get organized. And what I've learned is you need a small team of people. 7 people, and I can take back a county. 7 people, because there are 7 different types of work that has to be done. One of them, since I know you're an attorney, one of them is legal. So you need somebody on the team who knows what your state laws are, know what your local laws are, know what the election laws, what the election regulations are. That's important. You need somebody who's researching the contracts. How much are we spending for our elections? When are the contracts up? What are the terms of the contracts? So in other words, you need a lot of people. You need 7 people to do this organization. You need a data person, somebody who I can give data to and talk to them intelligently about. And I can say, hey, try sorting the rolls this way and look for this phenomenon, go knock on those doors. So you need people that are knocking on doors. You need people that are organizing movements. One of the most beautiful things, it's one of my absolute favorite parts of this movement, is after a local team has found actual fraud and documented it, what happens is you give testimony during the county supervisor meetings, and you read the cases of fraud right into the formal record. They can't stop you. That was one of the things about the courts. Remember, you were telling me the courts are rejecting the cases, so the evidence never makes it into the public scrutiny. Well, guess what? They can't stop you. You go to these public supervisor meetings, and you read the fraud cases that are fully documented right into the public record. It's a beautiful thing. So in other words, you're building a public movement. Now, I stress over and over again, we don't win with the evidence, we win with the movement. So you need somebody who's organizing the super mobs. And every month when that supervisor meeting is happening, you're flooding the room with angry citizens who are angry that their vote is being disenfranchised from them, that their constitutional rights are being violated because of this. And so you're organizing and building a movement. And every county, step 3 is to formulate a plan. And you base that plan based upon the kind of community you're in. What works in Alaska is not going to be what necessarily works in Shasta. So you have to kind of do that. And it takes about a year. That's step 4, where you're implementing the plan. But step 5, you're building the movement, and you're getting the media involved. You're getting the local community groups involved, the churches involved, the Rotary clubs, because you have actual evidence. In other words, the claims we're making are not, well, this Mr. Liddell said this and this and this, and Dr. Frank said that and that, and Donald Trump said this and that and the other thing. No. We found this ourselves. Here's the fraud. Here's the evidence. It's so much more powerful when the locals have their own evidence right in their own hands. And then step 6 is reviewing progress. Too many people go public with evidence that is not good evidence. So I call it peer review. That's what we call it in science. Before anybody goes public with anything, step 6 is you got to get it peer reviewed by people who know what they're talking about. I do that for free. Nothing I do, I don't charge for anything I do. So, I'm happy to help. And then step 7 of the 7 steps is called local empowerment. And I described some of that, when you've got the local sheriff to assigned a case number to it because you've given improbable cause and unassailable evidence. Maybe you've got local officials that are elected officials that have seen the evidence and they're validating it. And so what happens is the local community can say, we are nullifying all policies regarding our elections, all current policies, because they are disenfranchising us from our constitutional rights. And the example I give to people is if the governor comes out and says one day, oh, we're going to take away your guns, all the citizens just say, pound sand, because we're not going to listen to you because our constitutional rights, our Second Amendment allows us to keep that.
Civil disobedience.
Exactly. And it doesn't even have to necessarily be civil disobedience if you get your local community leaders to step up.
Nullify.
Which is what I try to do. And in most states, I have sheriffs that I can work with because the sheriff is the constitutional officer. He swears an oath to defend the constitutional rights of our citizens, and the sheriff can interpose. Now, I'm new to Alaska, so I don't know what that's going to be.
Yep, it's a state-controlled system. We don't have sheriffs. There's the law enforcement's even really a state-controlled agency all the way down. There are some first-class cities that have their own police departments, but the way that Alaska was created under its constitution designed by leftists out of California, Oregon, and Washington State was to create basically a top-down structure where there's very little local control. And that's one of the reasons why the fraud has occurred.
The civil disobedience, then you're right.
Yep, got to be.
But the thing is, it's justified. It's sort of like, when Antifa comes, I've been in a dozen cities across the country now, where Antifa shows up and the citizens grab their rifles and line the streets. And my favorite example is Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The leader there was telling me, Antifa showed up and the leader went up and talked to the leader of Antifa and he said, you guys, we believe in the First Amendment. You want to have a demonstration? Great, we'll all listen. But the first window that breaks and we're going to open fire. And so the Antifa people got right back in their vans and went on to the next town that didn't defend themselves. So that was the people exercising their constitutional rights. And it sounds like civil disobedience at first, but it isn't. It's the people exercising their constitutional rights. You're allowed to have a well-regulated militia. And the whole point of it is you're supposed to be defending yourself, not the government. If you're waiting for the government to save you, you're going to be waiting a long time. And I get the impression by talking to you and talking to the Alaskans that I've talked to, you guys are conditioned to being ruled from the top down. And so you're not used to thinking about your constitutional powers that you have. It's really not civil disobedience. It's really, you're the sovereigns, start acting like it. The Constitution empowers you. So, but I admit in Alaska, it probably will tilt towards some civil disobedience. But fat chance, if the government came in and said, we're going to take away your guns, something tells me a lot of communities in Alaska would say, come and try.
Yeah, no, there's a rugged individualist spirit here. And obviously it's a land of contradictions in the sense that how it started is not exactly how it is today. And frankly, even if you look at the component of people, one of the problems in Alaska is we have such a high turnover. So the political class is entrenched and established. And it's difficult to shake that loose. So you've got a combination of factors, even though I think the vast majority of people in Alaska are freedom-loving individuals who understand that the rights come from God, not from man, and are willing to defend those and are willing to be proactive with respect to them. The structure of government in the state makes it a much tougher nut to crack than other states where you ready at hand have a sheriff that can interpose. Even the state legal system, the judiciary, same way. You aren't electing local judges. They're all appointed from above. And so it's a way different scenario than what you have in other states, and it's more difficult to push back, but it can be done. Dr. Frank, I really appreciate what you're doing to educate Americans about the problem with vote fraud and the need for vote integrity and activism, how to generate that. How can people learn more about you and maybe even get a copy of that 7-point plan online?
Yeah, I don't have a website. As we talked about earlier, I've been canceled pretty aggressively. Every time I get a website up, it gets taken down. So I post pretty regularly on social media. I've got a Facebook page. Sorry, I don't have a Facebook page. I took that down. But I have a personal Facebook page. I have, a Telegram, a Rumble, that sort of thing. And what people should look for is follow the data with Dr. Frank. Follow the data with Dr. Frank, and that's the way to find me. People can also email me if they want my help. I don't charge, and I have people that help me keep up with my email. My email is Dr. Douglas, Douglas, G like George, Frank, Frank, Dr. Douglas G. Frank at Outlook.com. And so that's the way people can get copies. Or I've got my 7 steps, longer versions of it as well on my Rumble channel, which is Follow the Data with Dr. Frank. So that, you can be on Frank Social, you can be on Truth Social, Gab, Telegram, all those social media sites. I'm on Twitter as well. I guess they call it X now as well. So that's how people can get a hold of me and get copies, and I'm happy to share it. Recently, there's been a development. The John Birch Society noticed the work I was doing. They got very excited about it. They just featured me in this week's issue of their New American Magazine, several-page interview, and they've made their own version of a trifold version of my 7 steps, and they're distributing that all around the country. So it's getting out there.
Well, fantastic. So follow the data with Dr. Frank. Give me your email one more time.
Dr. Douglas G. Frank at Outlook.com. Douglas, G like George, Frank at Outlook.com.
Outstanding. Well, Restoring Liberty appreciates your time, the education that you've given our listeners, particularly about the issues facing Alaska. We wish you the best. Godspeed.